For most people, January 1st just feels like a calendar flip. But in California, it's also a rule change, hundreds of them. Some are small, some you'll notice right away in your paycheck, your rent, or even the way you shop. And some don't show up in your daily life at all until you walk into a city council meeting and realize the whole process feels different. Today I'm going to walk through a short list of the 2026 laws that are most likely to affect Calimesa residents and businesses. And then I'll end with one that's going to reshape public meetings, SB 707. Welcome to the 36th year of Calimesa.
Welcome to the Calimesa Insider Podcast, the official podcast of the City of Calimesa. Join City Manager Will Kolbow as he takes you behind the scenes of city projects, community stories, and the future of our hometown. Stay informed, stay connected. This is the Calimesa Insider Podcast.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Calimesa Insider Podcast of 2026. The beginning of the year typically brings new laws, so this episode will focus on some of the laws that might impact our residents and businesses the most, as well as those bills that impact the city. Now, while the ones that impact the city may not be seen directly by you, they do impact how we serve the public, so I believe it is important for the public to know what those impacts are. But before we get to that, just a quick note, our next City Council meeting will be Tuesday, January 20th. Take special note of that date because we normally meet on Mondays, but because of the Martin Luther King Memorial Holiday, city offices will be closed, so the meeting moves to Tuesday. So that's Tuesday, January 20th at 6 p.m. at the Norton Young Love Senior Center right here in Calimesa. Also, please do me a big favor and hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube so you never miss any full episodes or episode highlights. And even better, hit that share button and share the podcast with your friends and neighbors. So last year, the legislature passed or introduced more than 2,000 bills. Just under 1,000 of those made it to the governor's desk, and roughly 800 were signed into law. And once those laws are signed, the question is no longer whether they're good ideas or bad ideas. The question becomes how they'll actually work in the real world. Today, I want to talk through a short list of laws that matter most. I'm going to start with laws that directly affect everyday residents, the kinds of things people will feel in their daily lives. Then I'll talk about a handful of laws that affect how cities operate behind the scenes. And finally, I'll close with a deeper dive on SB 707, which significantly changes the Brown Act and how public meetings work going forward. This isn't a political episode. These are laws that are already passed. This is about understanding what actually changes in 2026 and why some things feel different at the local level. I'll start with the one most people are already aware of, even if they don't know the details, and that's the minimum wage increase. California law ties minimum wage to inflation. It's not a discretionary decision each year. The statute sets a formula, and for 2026, that formula results in another statewide increase. If you are earning minimum wage, the impact is direct. Your hourly pay goes up. For a lot of people, that helps offset rising costs for things like groceries, gas, and rent. Where this gets more complicated is everything that happens around it. For small businesses, labor is often the single largest expense. So when wages go up statewide, businesses look at prices, hours, staffing levels, and in some cases, whether they can keep operating the same way they have in the past. So for residents, this often shows up as two things happening at once: higher wages on one side and higher prices or reduced hours on the other. Cities don't set the minimum wage, but we feel it indirectly. Contract costs go up, vendor pricing changes, and it can become harder for public agencies to compete for workers when private sector wages adjust faster. Minimum wage increases are intentional and meaningful, but they don't exist in isolation. They ripple through the local economy in ways that aren't always obvious at first. Another change residents will feel, especially renters, involves habitability standards for rental housing. Starting in 2026, state law more clearly requires landlords to provide certain basic appliances as part of a habitable rental unit. Most notably, that includes a working stove and refrigerator. This sounds simple, but historically it wasn't always clear. In some situations, tenants were expected to supply their own appliances. In others, responsibility for replacement or repair wasn't well defined. This law tightens that up. For renters, it sets a clear baseline. When you rent a unit, there's less ambiguity about what should be included. For landlords, it changes expectations around unit preparation and maintenance. Now, for cities, this is where we start getting questions. People want to know whether this is something code enforcement handles, whether it's a civil issue, and what happens if a landlord doesn't comply. Often, the biggest impact of a law like this isn't often how it's enforced. It's that it resets expectations across the board and reduces gray areas that used to cause conflict. Another law residents will experience pretty quickly involves food delivery services. California has strengthened consumer protections for food delivery platforms, including clearer refund requirements for missing items, incorrect orders, or deliveries that never arrive. This isn't something cities enforce, but it's something people deal with regularly. Anyone who's used a delivery app knows how frustrating it can be when an order is wrong and you're stuck navigating automated customer service over a relatively small amount of money. This law is aimed directly at that experience. It requires platforms to be clearer about refunds and more responsive when things go wrong. Residents may never see the statute behind it, but they feel the difference in how disputes get resolved. It's an example of the legislature responding to very ordinary modern behavior, not an abstract policy issue, but something people encounter during a normal week. Another change that affects household finances involves overdraft and non-sufficient fund fees. Beginning in 2026, new limits apply to how certain financial institutions assessed overdraft fees, including how frequently they can be charged and under what conditions. For people living close to the margin, overdraft fees can escalate quickly. One timing issue can trigger multiple charges and make a small mistake expensive. This law doesn't eliminate overdraft fees altogether, but it does place clearer limits on them. For residents, the impact is fewer surprise charges and more predictability. Cities don't regulate banks, but we do get the calls. People often assume local government has authority here, and part of our role is helping residents understand where oversight actually sits. From a household budgeting standpoint, though, this change is meaningful. California continues to tighten restrictions on single-use plastic bags, and another phase takes effect in 2026. For shoppers, this mostly shows up at the checkout counter. Fewer free bags, more reliance on reusable bags. For retailers, it means compliance adjustments, signage changes, and sourcing alternatives. For cities, this is one of those laws where residents often assume local enforcement, even though enforcement rests elsewhere. Environmental laws like this tend to feel incremental, but taken together, they steadily change behavior. This is another step in that longer trend. One of the newer areas of law residents will start encountering involves artificial intelligence. SB 942 requires clearer disclosure when consumers are interacting with AI systems such as chatbots, automated customer service tools, or AI-generated content. The idea is straightforward. People should know whether they're interacting with a person or a system. As AI becomes more common in everyday services, confusion can build if that line isn't clear. This law tries to set expectations early. For residents, it affects how they interact with companies and services. For businesses, it affects how AI tools are deployed and disclosed. And for cities, it's also a signal. As public agencies start exploring AI internally, transparency and clear communication are going to matter. And of course, the one thing that we have to remember on that front is that it could be something, a foreign entity that's doing these things that may not be subject to those laws. So you may not always see these things show up, even though, they would need to be enforced. But if they're offshore, it's kind of hard to enforce those things. Several animal welfare laws take effect in 2026, including updated restrictions on certain veterinary practices and additional disclosure requirements related to pet sales. For residents, this affects pet ownership, veterinary care, and adoption decisions. For cities, animal welfare laws often intersect with animal control services and public education. Even when enforcement isn't directly local, residents still look to their city for guidance. This is another area where awareness is often the biggest impact. People want to know what's changed and what's expected. Updated disclosure requirements now apply to certain rental and short-term lodging arrangements. These laws don't prohibit short-term rentals, but they do require clearer notice and transparency around terms, fees, and conditions. For residents, it's about knowing what you're renting and under what expectations. For cities, it's about consistency, making sure local regulations align with state law and that residents get accurate information. Now, this change isn't obvious to residents, but it has real effects. The state has continued to strengthen enforcement around housing element and compliance. Cities that fall out of compliance face increasing consequences, including loss of discretion over housing approvals. For residents, this often shows up as projects moving forward that might not have moved forward in the past. For cities, the message is clear. Compliance is mandatory, timelines are fixed, and consequences are real. And finally, where CEQA reform sounds technical, residents feel it when projects move faster. Expanded exemptions and streamlined review reduce delays for qualifying housing project and limit procedural challenges. For residents, this can feel sudden. A project appears to move quickly with fewer pauses. From a city's perspective, the pace is set by state law. Discretion that existed in the past is narrowed intentionally. That shift is already in motion, and residents will continue seeing its effects in 2026. Now I want to talk about AB 130 because this is one that has direct impacts on how cities process housing projects. AB 130 is part of a broader set of changes to the Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, as I discussed previously. The intent is to move certain housing projects faster by expanding exemptions and streamlining environmental review. Historically, CEQA gave cities a fair amount of procedural flexibility. Environmental review could take time. Projects could be revised. Additional studies could be requested. And in some cases, litigation could significantly delay projects. AB 130 narrows that flexibility. Starting in 2026, cities are expected to apply CEQA exemptions and streamlining provisions much more broadly for qualifying housing projects. If a project meets objective standards, things like zoning, size, location, and consistency with the housing element, the city's discretion to slow that project down is much more limited. Operationally, this changes a lot. Timelines are shorter, there are fewer opportunities to pause a project once it starts moving, and there's less room to fix things later in the process. From a staff perspective, that raises the stakes. When timelines are compressed, mistakes are harder to correct. Reports have to be right the first time. Conditions have to be clear. And decisions get made with less cushion than they used to. AB 130 doesn't just affect housing outcomes, it changes how cities manage workload, risk, decision-making pressure when it comes to development. The next law that significantly affects city operations is SB 79. SB 79 allows higher density residential development near major transit corridors, even if local zoning would not otherwise allow that density. This is an important distinction. Cities do not adopt this density. City councils don't approve it. It's created by state law. What changes in 2026 is that more cities are fully subject to SB 79 based on housing element timelines and compliance status. That's when this law starts showing up in real applications, not just policy discussions. Operationally, this creates a different planning environment. City staff have to evaluate projects through the lens of state law first and local zoning second. When there's a conflict, state law controls. This affects staff reports, public hearings, and how projects are explained to the public. It also affects expectations. Residents often assume that higher density was a local policy choice, when in reality, the parameters were set at the state level. SB 79 doesn't approve projects directly, but it reshapes the boundaries of what cities can regulate. That has real operational consequences. There are also several changes taking effect in 2026 that affect cities as employers. California updates labor and employment laws every year, and public agencies are expected to comply immediately when those changes take effect. That includes updates to notice requirements, enforcement mechanisms, training obligations, and internal procedures. There's no phase-in period. On January 1st, compliance is expected. Operationally, this means cities have to review and update personnel policies, train supervisors, adjust internal processes, and make sure everything is documented correctly. These changes don't usually require hiring additional staff, but they do require staff time. And in smaller organizations like ours, that time comes from the same people already covering multiple functions. Residents don't usually see this work, but it directly affects how city organizations function day to day and how much staff capacity is available for other priorities. The last operational area I want to touch on involves privacy, data, and technology governance. California continues to tighten expectations around how organizations, including public agencies, handle personal data, cybersecurity, and digital systems. For cities, this goes beyond IT policy. It affects online services, records retention, incident reporting planning, vendor contracts, and internal training. Operationally, cities are expected to anticipate issues rather than respond after something goes wrong. That means developing policies, testing systems, and making investments that most residents never see. This is one of those areas where success looks invisible. If everything works, no one notices. But the obligation to get it right is very real, and the consequences of getting it wrong can be significant. As cities rely more on technology, these requirements become a larger part of day-to-day operations, even if they're not very visible from the outside. So those are the major operational changes outside of public meetings. The last one, and the most visible one, is SB 707. This is the law that will probably change how residents experience public meetings more than anything else taking effect this year. SB 707 makes significant changes to the Brown Act, which is the law that governs how cities hold meetings and how the public participates in them. Historically, the Brown Act assumed in-person meetings. During the pandemic, remote participation was required. After that, it became optional. SB 707 changes that framework once again. Under this law, if a city allows remote participation, there are now much more specific requirements for what that participation has to look like. That includes two-way audio, two-way video, and the ability for members of the public to provide comment remotely in real time. It also requires parity between people speaking in the room and people speaking remotely. And it requires cities to adopt written procedures for how meetings will handle technical failures. And by the way, I said may, this one is required for us. That last piece matters because the law assumes correctly that technology doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. It isn't just a matter of opening Zoom and seeing who logs in. It changes how meetings are structured, how public comment is managed, and how staff prepare ahead of time. Some provisions of SB 707 take effect January 1st. Other provisions phase in mid-year, particularly for what the statute calls eligible legislative bodies. From a practical standpoint, though, the work starts now. This affects equipment, staffing, procedures, and budgets. It's a real shift in how public meetings are expected to function, and it's something cities across the state are actively planning for. Now, I want to talk about the practical side of SB 707 because this is where the conversation often gets oversimplified. Expanding access is a reasonable goal. Remote participation lowers barriers for people who can't attend meetings in public. But running a hybrid public meeting well takes more than just good intentions. It requires cameras that actually capture the room, microphones that pick up speakers clearly, audio mixing so people online in the room can hear each other, reliable internet, and video platforms with enough capacity and controls to manage a live meeting. It also changes staffing needs. A traditional in-person meeting might involve a clerk, staff presenters, and council members. A hybrid meeting adds someone managing remote speakers, someone monitoring technical issues, additional setup time before the meeting, and additional work after the meeting to deal with recordings and uploads. And all of that happens at night. That means longer meetings, that means overtime, and that means additional costs. SB 707 doesn't reduce workload, it adds to it. Cities are now balancing expanded public access with staff capacity, meeting functionality, and limited budgets. Doing this poorly doesn't serve anyone. Meetings become chaotic, speakers feel frustrated, and staff gets stretched thin. Doing it well takes planning, equipment, training, and time. That's the reality of SB 707. It's a significant change to how public meetings work, and it's something cities are going to have to be working throughout 2026. So there you have it. If you have questions about any other new state laws that we have not covered here, please feel free to reach out either through direct message on Instagram or email me at calimesainsider@gmail.com, and I can do my best to answer your questions or at least point you in the right direction. Again, a reminder that our next City Council meeting will take place on Tuesday, not Monday, January 20th at 6 p.m. at the Norton Young Love Senior Center. Please follow and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. And if you prefer the audio version, the podcast can be found on all major podcasting platforms. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and thank you for staying informed. Take care.